All right, Father in heaven, we continue to thank and praise you for the opportunity to gather together as a people in this nation and freedom to worship, for freedom to assemble and to learn and to discuss and debate ideas. We pray that you continue to bless our conversation of what justice looks like and is to look like in our world, and especially through your church. Bless today as we talk about a very sensitive topic, that we would speak with compassion and love and full awareness of the less than stellar realities that sometimes exist in our midst. All these things we ask in your Son, Jesus' name. Amen. All right, the lesson I've been dreading is upon us. We're going to turn our attention to racial justice today. And primarily, we're going to take a look at critical race theory in a little bit. Before we do that, however, I want to begin with some scripture, just what I think is the most healthy way for Christians to think about race in our midst. And before we get into this topic, I do want to say that obviously when you have a class called Taking Social Justice Captive to Christ, you've communicated just by having that title that there's things about what I've said is the current rendition of the social justice movement that need to be taken captive to Christ. And so the whole class is sort of critical of a theory, which ironically is part of what we're going to be critical of these theories, is that they're only critical. But we're doing so in light of hopefully scriptural tenets and principles. But I think we have to acknowledge that the reason we would even have to have a discussion like this, the reason such a phenomena exists in our world is because of what has happened in the past, and especially in the past of our nation. We may not have lived during that time, we may not have perpetrated some of these atrocities, but we would be remiss if we did not acknowledge the real hurt that exists in African American communities when they think about their past. And so it's a painful thing, and some of it obviously continues into the present. As I talk today, I am hardly denying that racism can exist in churches, especially, or in our society, or that there are not racist or racial actions that happen. That is not the point of examining CRTs, to sort of just look the other way at some of these things. It is rather to say, is this theory going to help improve those things which many would hope could be improved upon? So that is, I think, something important. And I pointed your attention to Lucas Woodford's paper, Responding to Critical Race Theory. He actually begins his whole paper with an examination of slavery on a global level. It's been a phenomenon of far more than just what we think of in our American history. It's had some dark periods in every age of the world. And he begins by acknowledging, I think, the very real hurt that exists in the African American community, or I'm just going to use Black because it's easier to say, and I think it's hopefully acceptable terminology. So that just as a sort of upfront getting our hands around this. While the rest of things may look a little bit critical here, by no means am I absolving us of taking into consideration the real hurt of people. All right. By the way, there's also a schedule adjustment I want to point your attention to. I had intended next in 2 lessons to listen to a video by Vodi Bakum, mostly to give a Black voice, just sort of a voice in our midst. However, this evaluation that we're going to embark on next time of all critical social justice is probably most definitely going to bleed over into this lesson. I just don't think there's any way around it. This is a 55-minute video, so it leaves no room for error. So I've got a note taker handout for that. I'll give you that next week along with a link. This is something you could easily watch on your own. Largely, he's going to say some of the same kind of things that you'll hear me saying. I think it would be beneficial perhaps if you wanted to look at that, but what we're going to do in 2 lessons is continue our evaluation. That's the CRT that I was going to say critical social justice, because it's going to look at the whole enchilada. And then what I'm going to do in that place, I think there's a desire here to look at some texts. We're just going to live in some biblical texts that I think often maybe aren't as clear in how we use them as Christians. So for those of you who already requested a Year of Jubilee article from me and read it, you're going to have to hear that one again, but there's about 5 more texts we're going to look at. And then we'll wrap up on the 13th by talking about, in light of all we've learned, how do we still confront very real injustice in our world, but do it in a way that we would not compromise Christian truth. So a little schedule adjustment there. Today, again, is the last day that might seem like a philosophy lesson. Well, I can't promise that completely, but today our goal is to eventually get to CRT, and I've got 4 questions up there. I want to talk about where it came from. So we know all ideas come from somewhere. It's good to know where they come from. We know what is it from the authors themselves. What does it count for? That gets a little bit evaluative. I'm trying to just present the theory in fairness to itself. That will shift in a little bit of a direction of analysis and then finally, where is it? And you may be surprised some places it is, you may not, depending on how in tune you are with these kind of issues. All right. So as we talk about racial justice, it's important to think from, we have a story of the scriptures that helps us understand where it comes from. I think probably, I think Martin Luther King's, this line that gets used often from his speech, I have a dream that my 4 children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. That was his vision of what the ceasing of racial divisions would be like, right? That we would not see first something that is only skin deep in humanity, that we would look instead to a person who they are and judge them according to that. That is not consistent necessarily with what CRT would hope for, but I still think MLK's vision there is probably just a good summary of what a racially just nation would look like. The Tower of Babel in the Old Testament helps explain why there are different races, or I'm going to show you, I think a better term might be ethnicities in our world today. You know the story. They tried to build a tower to reach the heavens. God said there's no end to the evil they will do. So he scattered their languages. He put sort of this natural barrier between people groups. I can't speak with you, so I'll go hang out with these people over here who I can communicate with, to keep them from colluding together and magnifying their evil. And when that happened, that explains a lot of things. Number one, it explains why there are other languages. If the evolutionary account is true and humans evolved and began to be able to speak with one another and communicate, why would they ever start speaking completely different languages? It would make no sense, right? There would be no impetus to do that, right? But the Tower of Babel helps us understand why there would even exist such diverse language groups in the world to begin with. And there's a scattering of the nations that happen, and then also very easily can explain why there's so many, such a variety of skin tones throughout the world. And so I'm sure there's probably, Steinbacher's here, probably some more biology adept people here. I ripped these from Answers in Genesis, but I don't know that this is the way melanin works in skin exactly 100%, but you all learned Punnett squares back in biology class. You have dominant and recessive traits that can code for different things. You can see how in a population that would play out. The larger the parameters, the variety and diversity you could get, especially when you have genetic variation that is concentrated in various spots. So as people spread after this biblical event, genetic variation sort of takes its course, and you have different predominations of skin color in various parts of the world. Acts 17 shows us that we should not think in terms of racial, at least skin tones, as far as dividing. He's clear for Acts 17. It says, God has made from one man every nation that dwells on the face of the earth. So we're all equally descendants of Adam and Eve, or if you want to go further, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, all bearing God's image as his creatures in the world, created with dignity and worthy of respect. So Ken Ham makes the point when he talks about race from the Answers in Genesis organization. He says there's only one race, and I think that's biologically and most importantly biblically true. And perhaps then, instead of speaking of races, maybe a more Christian way to speak of this, or just a real way to speak of it, would be ethnicities. Just talk about different ethnicities, different culture groups, and people groups that arisen up in various places around the world as the world has taken its course. But what's very clear is that in Jesus, there is certainly to be no longer any distinction or division among racial or ethnic lines. Specifically, Jew and Gentile were very separate, of course, in the New Testament, and part of Paul's main job, if you read the New Testament, 75% of it can be understood as him trying to bring Jew and Gentile together in one body under Christ. These two people groups that had been forever separate. You had the Jews, and everybody else was the barbarians, the heathens, the Greeks, right? And now all of a sudden they are receiving the same Holy Spirit, outpouring the Holy Spirit that Peter and the disciples did at Pentecost in Jerusalem. And breaking down that barrier is a huge part of what's going on in the New Testament. You see this in Ephesians. He himself is our peace, who has made us both one and has broken down in his flesh the dividing wall of hostility, that he might create in himself one new man in the place of two, making peace. Galatians 3:28, there's neither Jew nor Greek. You are all one in Christ Jesus. And so it should be hopefully obvious, but it needs to be said. Racism, and I would define that biblically as a thought, word, or a deed that's prejudice towards someone else because of their race or ethnicity, is unequivocally, always, in every place, and every time, sinful. All right? It just needs to be said. If we think we harbor racist sentiments in our hearts and our minds, and that is something just like any other sin that we should repent of. Okay? The biblical truths concerning race cannot be reconciled with the way Christians have justified treating people of different ethnicities or races in the past. I was talking with someone yesterday. I mean, you can even make a case that the Bible doesn't outright prohibit a slavery arrangement, although they meant something very different by that than what we would hear in our words with slavery. But the inhumane treatment of others by people in the name of Christianity is abhorrent. And had our ancestors in the Christian faith, maybe not your genetic descendants, but people in the past in our nation, treated people this way, perhaps we wouldn't have the hostilities that we're still dealing with today. So we have to acknowledge that there has been wrong done. Doesn't mean we necessarily are guilty of that, although some would say we are, but it just does mean we can't go forward on it. Okay. And besides, all of our racist sentiments will be burned out in the new heavens and the new earth, and those who maybe thought their race was superior in the new heavens and earth will be very surprised to see people of every tribe, tongue, and nation. And I think you guys mostly know this, so I'll quit harping that. All right, so let's turn to what critical race theory says about race and racism in our midst today. It's fast becoming America's new institutional orthodoxy. It's the preferred way to see things in corporations and in our world. Many Americans have not heard of it, although it's been in the news a lot lately with schools. So probably some people have at least heard of it, but not all understand it. And that is understandable because it has come really, really quickly. Probably from its rise to prominence out of the universities till now has been less than a decade. And in the past 3 years, it's been really accelerating. And to understand critical race theory, we do have to begin by understanding Marxism, which is sort of why we took a journey through that today. Hopefully that'll make more sense today. So you go to your outline there, we're going to be in part 2. Why did economic Marxism, the kind that we talked about Karl Marx promoted, why did that fail in the American West? Well, one reason was the realization of what has been called the American dream. In the mid-'60s, there were Marxist intellectuals, we're going to talk about them in a moment, in the Frankfurt School, And they began to realize worker revolutions like that had occurred in Eastern Europe and in Russia, they were never going to occur in Western Europe or the United States. Why? Because even though capitalism was not perfect, what it was largely doing was expanding a middle class. It was expanding their standards of living. People felt their lives were improving. And so they did not develop a high degree of class consciousness. They mostly thought that if they worked hard and did the right things, that over time they could eventually edge up. And maybe even if they didn't arrive where they wanted to be, they'd set up a better life for their children, send them to college, and their children had a hope of doing better than they did. And as long as that hope sort of resided in the human heart, that by my hard work and my effort, I can maybe better myself, people didn't feel the need to rise up against the bourgeois and reclaim property and redistribute wealth, et cetera. So I'm not saying the American dream is perfect or that that's what we should even dream or aspire to as Christians. I'm just saying generally that's why Marxism didn't prove successful in the West. It was never even really attempted outside of the university. The other big thing I think that happened was when things started to get pretty hot and heavy in the 60s, the proponents who would be pushing for revolution actually lost out to the civil rights movement. We enshrined in law the promise of freedom and equality. We would rather do that on the basis of law than overthrow the structures of our nation. Now, that doesn't mean that the minute those laws were passed, everything was perfect. But what I think it does mean is that racist sentiments were less in the generation that followed that than they were prior. So it's a road to improvement. People can argue all day long about whether things happened fast enough or whether it should have been more ultimate or sudden. But the idea was let's recognize this in our law and let's work to improve. But rather than abandon Marxist projects, what happened was scholars still believed in their Marxism. They still believed in a more equitable distribution, especially of the world's resources. And so they adapted their theory in light of the racial and social unrest of the 60s. They saw that race was far more powerful of a card to play in society than was class. Class wasn't working, but race was a touch point, especially in our nation and after what had happened prior. And so they shifted their hope for revolution, it was believed, would have to come through those who were dispossessed by racial and ethnic categories. So they are the new oppressed, and then by nature, largely white males became the oppressors, okay? But for a long time, this just resided in the university. The story of how it's come to full is what we'll turn to next. I'm going to skip that chart. Here's John Mcarthur. He wrote a foreword for Strackham's book, Christianity and Wokeness. I put him up here as a somewhat well-respected evangelical. He's certainly not a Lutheran, but sound, and his is his analysis, and I think he's right. Pretty much everybody I read has the same analysis. So CRT has been an aggressive force in academic circles since the late 1980s, radically affecting the way many in the Western culture view the world. CRT combines tenets of Marxism and postmodernism to cynically dismantle social structures. He says wherever it is introduced, it feeds disunity, ethnic hostility, promotes identity politics, et cetera, et cetera. But the point of this quote is Marxism and postmodernism become the ingredients that give birth to critical race theory. So here's how it goes. I'll try not to bore you with this, but again, if we have an idea and we're not willing to take the time to say, where did that idea come from? We might not realize everything that's involved in it. So this man up here is Antonio Gramsci. He was an Italian communist who ended up spending the last few years of his life in jail. He comes up with this idea of cultural hegemony. So I had to even look up how to pronounce that word, but hegemony is the idea that all the world is power structures. It's people in power exercising their power over other people. And part of the reason for that is that people that are on the bottom allow it to happen. They just put up with it. And he says the bourgeois dominance ran far deeper than economics. He says Marx was good to start, but he said it's more than It's more than just wealth. It's literally everything. The entire culture is a complex web of power. Lukács, a Hungarian communist, he kind of furthers these sentiments, and he says that he introduces this concept of standpoint epistemology, and that's the idea that only if you're an oppressed individual can you truly understand what's going on in the world. The powerful, they're sort of blind to what they're doing. And so the oppressed have a knowledge or a viewpoint that those in the oppressor role could just never, ever understand. That feeds in later to some of the stuff that's going on. Both of these men influence a school in Frankfurt called the Institute for Social Research. You see a few names up there: Horkheimer, Adorno, Marcuse. Horkheimer says we need to take Marxist critical theory of economics, but we need to apply it to all of society for structures. And he kind of comes up with this idea that the powers are built into the structures of our world. They're just there by nature. So the Frankfurt School starts in 1924, and it starts from the basic assumption that if there's any inequities in society, that's a sign society is broken. We have to figure out what's wrong with it. We have to overthrow it in order to ever hope to fix it.
Was it Marxism essentially communism?
The general idea, yeah, you use those somewhat synonymous, yes. So I might go back and forth between the two of them here. But what arises out of this, you can see, is a concept called cultural Marxism. That's how they identified themselves and how others began to identify the school, because now we want equity, but we're not just talking about bank accounts here. We're talking about across all facets of society, including honor, prestige, acceptance, etc. And as the school moves forward, basically, they see that basically every aspect of culture has totalitarianism baked into it, right? They uncover it in education, in religion, in the entertainment industry, when it comes to sexuality and sexual preferences, etc. The whole world is a big power struggle, and the dominant folks who are in charge are always keeping others down. And so we have to kind of sort of overcome that. Now, how this gets into America, Marcuse has a huge following in the 1970s among college students who are beginning to study in critical fields in college. And so we get to this, there's a whole burgeoning field of critical studies now. At most universities, you can take ethnic studies or maybe African-American studies, gender studies. There's women's studies, gay and lesbian studies, queer theory. There's even a new field burgeoning right now. I don't know if this is actually a degree in any university, but it's definitely a field of study, a subfield of critical theory, fat studies, okay? And so all of these are sort of tied up in the critical social justice movement. We're just sort of singling out racial justice and CRT today as one manifestation of that. But when we critique critical social justice next week, we're going to be keeping all this in mind, because it all has the same sort of general concept that anybody who's in a minority position by nature is oppressed. And these are all talking about how do we right society over and against the oppressor. Oops. Frankfurt School, again, traditional theory tried to describe phenomenons. How does it work? Why does it work that way? If there's deficiencies in it, how do we improve that? Critical theory proceeds from a prescriptive normative moral vision for society. In other words, we want less disparities, and then it prescribes activism to remake it in their image. I'm going to read this chart. I know this is a lot of words, but I think this is important. Marx's worldview is built on the notion that the world can be divided into two basic categories: oppressors and victims. Oppressors exercise their power and domination, their hegemony, according to Gramsci, through maintaining a network of often stealthy institutions, structures, and systems that result in their being advantaged or privileged in common parlance. Marx limited his focus to the structures and systems that resulted in economic inequality, but the Frankfurt School and its social theories expanded Marx's economic class-based framework to include inequalities of other groups, including the sexes, gender, and identity groups. The result, however, was mostly the same. The solution is always to raise the consciousness of the oppressed, become aware that you're a victim, and then mobilize to rise up against those who you feel are an oppressive stance over you. Gramsci died with this hope. He said, the civilized world has long been thoroughly saturated with, oh gosh, this is the problem with recording the lesson. I don't know if that word is up there. For Christianity for 2,000 years. Any country grounded in the Judeo-Christian world values cannot be overthrown until those roots are cut. But to cut the roots, to change the culture, a long march through the institutions is necessary. Gramsci hated Judeo-Christian values because he did not believe that his ideas could ever take off in a society that embraced Christianity and especially embraced the hope for a life to come. And he says this is going to take a long time. And the Frankfurt School, who followed Gramsci, began their long march through the institutions. Well, Gramsci dies in 1937, but by using this cultural strategy of a long march, the Frankfurt School social theorists and their allies have now, in our day, achieved stunning success at embedding their presuppositions into Western public education, academia, the media now, entertainment, big business, and politics. Today, ideological social justice, or as I said, sometimes that's a synonym for critical social justice, dominates the commanding heights of Western culture and has even made inroads into mainstream evangelicism and the church, which is why we're taking the time to talk about it. Don't worry, I'll never teach on this again, ever. All right, so how does this cultural Marxism, how does this pour into critical race theory? Well, Angela Davis does her dissertation under Marcuse. She begins a field called critical legal studies. Derek Bell, a lawyer from Harvard, actually represents her in a legal case in the early 1970s. They form a bond. He acknowledges his debt to Angela Davis and the Frankfurt School for Ideas. Derek Bell, as we'll see in a minute, is considered the father of critical race theory. We'll turn to him in just a second, but before we do that, I want to talk about the other ingredient, postmodernism. Postmodernism. I'm supposed to be at 35 minutes by the time I get done with this. I'm not doing very good. All right. Postmodernism is an idea basically that there is no absolute truth. There is no absolute truth. This comes about largely in the 60s. Two principal players in this, Jacques Derrida, deconstruction of language. He begins to say all texts are exercises of power over and against other people. And what we've got to do is deconstruct these texts. They may seem to say this, but we're going to find out they say something very different. And so we have to figure out how even a text like the Gospels and the Bible are trying to exercise power over a culture. All right, so Derrida begins it. Michel Foucault takes this even further and talks about the deconstruction of knowledge. How do we know what truth is? He says all truth is socially constructed. We can't know what truth is. Foucault was a pedophile who raged against a society who told him it was not okay to have sex with little children. All right. And so he's also a very, very intelligent man. And so he develops a whole philosophy around the fact that, hey, if you want to tell me I'm wrong for this, how can you know that? That's just you exercising power over me. But nevertheless, this idea of subjective truth, no one truth we can point to, this post-modernity is the age we live in. You hear, especially younger generations say this all the time. Well, that's your truth, but this is my truth. You say, well, this Bible is true. Well, that's that truth. That's not my truth. It becomes very difficult to have conversations about right and wrong if post-modernity is true, but it's sort of the world we live in. So cultural Marxism and post-modernity sort of pour into what becomes critical race theory. Derek Bell starts this basically in 1989. He, Kim Crenshaw, Peggy McIntosh, Richard Delgado, they all get together in Madison, Wisconsin at a convent and have a conference and present some papers. And this is the very start of critical race theory, 1989. You were buying your first Game Boy, critical race theory was born. It's been going on since then, sort of under our noses. Now we all know about it here. 30 years later, it's all the rage. So Bell says, and you can see this on your handout, progress in American race relations, he says, is largely just a mirage. It obscures the facts that whites continue consciously or unconsciously to do all that is in their power to ensure domination. So this is the worldview of Bell. It looked like we passed these laws. It looks like things are maybe getting better, but really they're not. Really, it's just as bad as it's always been. Kim Crenshaw writes a paper on intersectionality. I'm not going to read you that whole quote. The idea of intersectionality is the more oppressed labels you can put on yourself, the greater your victimhood is. So if you're a person of color, that's a victim, right? But if you're a woman who's a person of color, now you're really a victim, right? The degree of oppression against you is multiplied. And so the more labels you can claim, the more culture is standing over and against you. So that's her idea. Peggy McIntosh, she comes up with this concept of white privilege. And not that she's the first one to coin that term. She wrote a paper called Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack, and talks about how white people, when they go around, they have all this privilege that people of color don't necessarily have, that we're just unaware of. Okay, and so this is part of kind of what critical race theory becomes. And then Richard Delgado writes this book in 2002, I believe, is the first time it comes out. It's in its third edition now, on what critical race theory is. And he talks about systematic racism. And he says racism is ordinary. It's not aberrational. It's a normal science. It's the usual way a society does business. And so I've got to read you something if you want to understand what's going on here. I said at the beginning, I thought racism could be defined as a thought, a word, or a deed against someone of a different race or ethnicity that is prejudiced in some way. That is not how critical race theory defines what racism is. And I found a helpful definition in this book. When critical race theorists speak of racism, they're not referring to prejudice on the grounds of race. So if you want to understand what they're saying about their theory, you can't define racism maybe the way you walked in the room. They define it as a radicalized system that permeates all interactions in society. Every interaction between a white person and a person of some other color is racist in nature. And yet this remains largely invisible, except to those who experience it, or who have been trained by critical methods to be awakened to see what's going on. Okay? So if you say, I just don't feel like I'm racist, doesn't matter. That's not the kind of racism they're talking about. You are, by nature of the fact that you participate in society as a majority individual, if you happen to be white. Everybody in a given room on a given day is white. So that's kind of the mindset. So here from Delgado, then Robin DiAngelo writes a more recent book, White Fragility. This comes out in what year? 2018. She goes around teaching diversity, equity, inclusion workshops in Fortune 500 companies. We'll talk about her term in a minute. Basically, white fragility is the stress that white people feel anytime someone wants to talk about race. As soon as we try to say, defend it, that's just our white fragility. We're very fragile when it comes to discussions. We're not willing to admit the truth, is sort of what DiAngelo says. And then finally, Ibram X. Kendi, he's all the rage. His book, How to Be Anti-Racist. Kendi says it's not enough to be not racist. You actually have to be anti-racist, and that means doing the beck and call of critical race theory and your whole life sort of advocating for things that are against racism. America, he deems as a country that's inherently flawed because racism is built into all of our structures. We have to dismantle this framework. And usually diversity training in universities and the workplace are trying to acclimate white people and teach them that they are by nature inherently racist. Maybe some of you have sat in on that. All right, so what is all this summed up as? I'm going to read a few definitions. Oops. Here's the UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs. I put this one on your handout. It says CRT recognizes that racism is ingrained in the fabric and systems of American society. The individual racist need not exist to note that institutional racism is pervasive in the dominant culture. This is the analytical lens CRT uses in examining existing power structures. CRT identifies that these power structures are based on white privilege and white supremacy, which perpetuates the marginalization of people of color. It also rejects the traditions of liberalism and meritocracy, which are vehicles for self-interest, power, and privilege. In case you know, I'm not just cherry picking their definition. Here's Encyclopedia Britannica somewhat similar. It says, the view that the law and legal institutions are inherently racist, and that race itself, instead of being biologically grounded and natural, is socially constructed by white people to further their own, basically, interests. All right, so that's what this ideology teaches. And I want to back up to this right here, because these 8 principles here are taken directly from Delgado's book on critical race theory. Here's the page references. They're also in your handout. So just so you know, I'm not creating a straw man. I'm not creating a parrot. These are from those who propose it. Let's look at these 8 characteristics here. I already talked about racism as normative or systemic. 2, race is a social construct created to allocate privilege. All right. Now, part of that is true. I mean, I started off the class by saying that race is kind of a social construct that maybe we shouldn't even use. But their claim is that it was created by those in power for the express purpose of oppressing others. 3, white privilege maintains white dominance. Colorblindness keeps minorities in subordinate positions. This is kind of confusing to many people, because you thought that to be not racist, you should be colorblind. That is, not see color, just see everyone as a child in the eyes of God. But yet, if you refuse to see color, that could stop you from seeing disparities that are out there based on race, and so keep you from taking appropriate action. So it's a tricky one there. 5, voices of color have special access to knowledge. That's that standpoint epistemology. Where you stand helps you determine what you really know. 6, majority groups tolerate progress only when it benefits them. This is called convergence theory. If your interests converge with people of color, then you'll do something. So the civil rights movement would be described as the Kennedys knew they could get some votes. And so they passed some civil rights acts because it helped them stay in power, right? That's a very cynical view of why they did what they did. Could there be some truth to that? Perhaps there could, but that's the kind of analysis that comes to this. So right now, why are corporate America embracing woke principles? Because they're profiting like mad, right? And there's probably some truth to that, but the idea is they're only acting that way, not because they actually care, but because they have some benefit of their own. Now, please don't confuse what I'm saying here about critical race theory with my own personal views or what I think is right, okay? The analysis is coming largely next lesson. Questions, the liberal social societal order, liberal there not meaning like liberal or conservative, but liberalism as in things like the Constitution, the rule of law, all these systems, see, have to be called into question because they were built by a largely white culture. 8, history should be reinterpreted according to minority experience, sometimes called memory studies. This is why you have things like the 1619 Project, right? You thought the nation was founded in 1776. No, let's tell another story from a minority standpoint of view. Okay, can't emphasize enough the goal of all critical social justice theories and some of those other things I wrote up there, more equality of outcome for marginalized groups. That's what it really all comes down to. Now, is it wrong to have to strive for less disparity? That's not what I'm saying. But the rage will not stop until those on the oppressed deem that things are fair enough. So this is kind of where we talked about where critical race theory came from. I've just talked about what it is. Now I want to talk about what it counts for. What it counts for. All right. It is a new Marxism. It's not the kind of Marxism Marx taught, but the tenets of being woke or awakening to the reality that all society is driven by oppressor relationships is definitely, and critical theory itself has its origins in Marxism. This is directly where this term woke comes from. You have to wake up, people, and see what's going on in order to be able to fix it. Okay, so in the first rendition of Marxism, you have the proletariat and bourgeois, and the power structure was capitalism. In cultural Marxism, it's all minorities. Now, there's still some people talking about the evils of capitalism, but largely the conversation has shifted. Who are the victims? any minority. Who's the oppressor? Whites, right? What's the power structure? Whiteness or white supremacy. When it comes to sex, the victims are, of course, females. This is where you get some of this patriarchal stuff. Males are the oppressors over and against females. And what's keeping that in place? They blame Christian morality on that. And then finally, when it comes to sexuality and gay and lesbian or trans or queer or anything like that, who are the oppressors over and against these people? Well, Christians, not all, because some don't have any problem with that, but especially Christians. Christian morality, again, is the culprit. So right now, the focus is on whiteness, right? But eventually, the other shoe will probably drop, and Christians are going to be called the main oppressor class. All right. I want to read this. I think this is important. Many Christians have only a vague awareness that this ideology, where it comes from, they don't see it as dangerous necessarily. When they hear social justice, they don't think it's a whole lot different than the kind of justice the Bible talks about. Justice is a deeply biblical idea, but the way critical theories are defining justice is not always in line with Scripture. It's in fact a comprehensive worldview rooted in, as I showed you, tried to show you, Marxist and postmodern presuppositions that actually compete with a biblical worldview. Now, here's the important thing. Today's social justice proponents typically deny the Marxist roots of their worldview. If you talk to someone who has embraced critical race theory and you say, you know what you are, you're just another kind of Marxist, they are not, they're going to deny that label, all right? To be charitable, we must grant that many of them probably don't know the connection. They haven't taken the time to walk through and trace the dots like we just did today. A careful examination, however, of social justice and neo-Marxism reveals that they are cut from the same ideological cloth. Ideas that have already, in the history of our world, had destructive consequences, okay? And so that's why there's maybe a reason to say something stinks about this, dividing all the world up into oppressed and oppressors. CRT also counts as a completely new worldview. A worldview is anything that tries to tell you the story of everything. Okay, it tries to account for a whole system of how your world's put together. And in this worldview, the single lens of all reality is race. It's always, always, always race. So you see a disparity, make one up. I'm hesitant to give an example because I don't want to take anybody off. But make a disparity. You will say the reason for that disparity must be race. And then you will go about how can we take steps to correct that. Now, race could be a reason for a disparity, and that would be racially unjust, and society should take steps to try to remedy that. But not always, not in every case. Here's how this works. White people create whiteness, which is a set of normative privileges that we all share that we don't even know we have. White people create privilege, a series of unearned advantages because of who God made us to be. White people created white supremacy. We put all these systems, supports, and structures in place to keep us at the top. Please don't hear me say I believe this stuff. I'm saying this is kind of how the narrative goes. White people created white complicity. We are guilty of this, even if we think we're not, because we participate in the society that upholds it. Right? We try to keep equilibrium. We try to remain comfortably ignorant, push it all out. And especially we're fragile when it comes to talking about this. We won't talk about the grips that whiteness exerts on us, whether we know it or not, knowingly or unknowingly. I also put a glossary here for you from Strachan's book that defines those terms just a little bit differently if you want to get another take on it. All right, what to say next? Scott David Allen. This is how this might work out. Okay, Scott David Allen was a missionary at 75 countries around the world and worked with people of many ethnicities. Here's what he said in response to Dr. Burnley, VP for an organization called Sojourners, who wrote this: "We must expose a central lie at work in the church. The lie is this: white people were created to rule and everyone else to be ruled. This lie is the foundation upon which unjust American structures, systems, and policies rest. Here's what Scott Allen said. He says, in my 35 years of working with church leaders around the world from over 75 nations, so he's got some chops here. He's got a basis on which to speak that I don't have, certainly. He says, I've never met anyone who endorsed the idea that white people were created to rule over everyone else. Yet, according to this statement, someone is asserting that that's the central lie at work in the church today. Okay? So you see how embracing such a worldview causes someone to make a statement like this. The church is living a lie. The lie is, if you're a member of a white church, you were just in place to put up. And to deny that is just your white fragility talking. And Scott David Allen says, look, man, I've traveled around the world, and I've never met a single person who would assert that. These are the worldviews that are competing now for the hearts and minds of even Christians. When I talk about the single lens of racism, I already said every disparity has to be, if you try to explain the disparity as anything other than racism, it's you're being aversive to racism. Anti-racists will cry foul if you say, like, what about a person has mom and dad together? Don't they generally do better in life? Don't statistics show that? Yeah, it's victim blaming. Talk about criminality, talk about maybe unintended consequences of welfare programs and dependency. All these things are just ruled out of bounds because there's one single lens that even scientific facts can be considered racist if they are interpreted as people trying to just keep equilibrium and stay in power. So those are out of bounds. Here's just a few examples that were in the news recently. I just kind of have my eye on this. Look at this, Joe Manchin, right? He didn't pass the Build Back Better bill, or wasn't going to vote for it or whatever. So what is immediately said? It's a white man, Joe Manchin. That's why he didn't do it. He's white. Or Salvation Army. Red kettle donations were lagging, right? What was that attributed to? Not just a down year. Well, they posted a racism guide on their website. Then a couple weeks later, they see that the donations are down. It's immediately blamed on posting this guide. So those are just some subtle examples there. I probably could have went and searched for a bunch more. I just saw these things and threw them in here to say, see how you see everything through the lens of race. You may have heard the term Kafka trap before. This is the idea of, are you a witch? Yes, okay, burn you. Are you a witch? No. Well, what would a witch say? No, burn the witch, right? That's kind of the idea of a Kafka trap. You're darned if you do, darned if you don't. And so if you say, look, I just don't feel like, not that I've never had a racist thought, and I just don't feel like I'm a racist person. Someone said, that's not true. That's what a racist would say. That's exactly what white fragility looks like. And so you really can't get out from under this. The only thing to do is agree and then pay the penance of anti-racism. And so the traps are set. It's very difficult to have a conversation about this because, look, someone made this chart. It might be a little stilted, but there's some truth to this. If a white person moves out of an area, it's white flight. You can't put up with minorities. If you move in, gentrification. I had to look up what that word meant, but that's trying to make the place kind of more trendy or whatever, changing the culture in a bad way. If you see color, well, you're racist. But as we've seen, according to CRT, if you try not to see color, you're ignoring racism. What are you going to do? If you don't partake in the culture of others, you're being not inclusive. You're kind of over here in your own little bubble. But if you do engage in culture, sometimes you'll be accused of cultural appropriation. So not every time does it play out like this, but you can see it becomes very difficult to navigate in the midst of this worldview. And one of the things we're going to talk about next time is there's really not any room for forgiveness or mercy. There's no way to be forgiven of this new original sin. And that gets me to this last point here of what does CRT count as? Truly, it counts as a new religion. Even proponents of CRT are acknowledging it has a religious value to it. Because it is a worldview of everything, It is a whole system through which we live and organize our life. That's why this book here talks about religions in conflict. I'm not gonna, I'll just build this here. You see this on your handout. You know, here's the big one. The new original sin is racism, right? To be born again is to be woke and finally see the reality of what's going on. So there's religious components to the entire thing there. Now, some people think that's a little strong. I don't, because of what I'm going to read you next. What's to account for the wild success of Marxism 2.0 in the Western culture? Why is there such a following to this? While secularism severely undermined Christianity in Europe and America, it couldn't provide a compelling religious alternative to fill the vacuum and meet the innate need for morality and purpose. So if you throw religion out, as religion becomes less important to people in Western countries, you still have a desire for meaning and purpose and a way to organize my life that makes sense. So if Christianity's out and that's not what's organizing my life, there's a void there that inevitably needs to be filled. You see this with like Americans going and joining extreme Islamic movements. You think, why? Hey, it gives me a purpose. It tells me how to organize my life. It's better than this vacuum I'm feeling. Ideological social justice is perhaps understood as a postmodern religious alternative. There are more than this. This is not the only one, but it is indeed one of the successor ideologies to Christianity. Andrew Sullivan said this. He says, for many, especially the young, discovering a new meaning for life is thrilling. Social justice ideology does everything a religion should. It offers an account of the whole. The human life and society must be seen entirely as a function of social power structures in which various groups have spent all of human existence oppressing other groups, and it provides a set of principles to resist and reverse this web of oppression. As a result, many people, including Christians, have decided that fighting for social justice is the new purpose of their lives, right? It becomes the end all be all. There's even a term for it, right? The social justice warrior. I'm hearing all the time of families who are divided because this niece or that nephew is now a self-proclaimed social justice warrior and has basically cut off any and all family or friends who don't see the world now like they do. Just like Jesus said Christianity would divide houses and homes, so too social justice sometimes does. All right, where is it showing up? This is finally, where is it? Down there, number 4 on my thing. It's a lot of places. You see it in diversity, equity, and inclusion training in workplaces. The famous example, the one that got a lot of notoriety, there's our friend Robin DiAngelo, right? Teaching at Coca-Cola, and this, blurb here, try to be less white. Of course, after this came out on the news, Coca-Cola pulled her training off the website and did a lot of backtracking, but that was kind of alarming to some that, they would be called into doing that. The government is bought in 100%. Here's an article, the government's role in inclusion, diversity, and equity. Here's the secretary or the chief of staff of the Navy right there, right? Kendi is on their reading list. Used to be things like Lincoln on Leadership or Ulysses S. Grant's Principles of Leadership. Now it's Kendi, right? He gets called on the carpet by Congress. Why are you reading this stuff? Basically, this book says the Constitution is completely racist and needs to be abolished as is. They're teaching that to people who literally stood up and said, I will die to defend this Constitution. People are writing books in the military about it. Matt Lohmeyer, graduate of the Air Force Academy years after me. See how young he is? He wrote a book, Irresistible Revolution, kind of talking about what he's seen. Hassan wrote one there. Even my beloved Air Force Academy, just got my ring resized so I can wear it again. And they're teaching CRT to their cadets, all right? CRTs in schools and educational systems. Maybe it's not called that. We can debate all day long about, is it really in Virginia schools or not? Someone wrote an article, yes, it is. But it is filtering down. It's no longer a university phenomenon anymore. You see it in things like I said, the 1619 project versus the 1776 project. You see it even in math standards. Here's USA Today article, is math racist, right? Here's our word equitable. a pathway to equitable math instruction. And these are straight quotes from this guide that Oregon schools are using and some others. You know, white supremacy can show up in math if you focus on getting the right answer. If you try to teach math the way you learned it, if you address mistakes. So you see how this, I didn't put this up there so everybody go, I can't believe they're calling right answers. You know, I'm not just trying to stir up all the right-wing Tucker Carlson conservatives in the room here, all right? But it is out there, and I'm just trying to show how it is filtering into schools and into how we're forming the minds of our children. I'm not just trying to put this up here to anger you or to say that that's everywhere. Even showing up in medicine, look at this. The American Medical Association put out a guide, Advancing Health Equity, a guide to language and concepts. This is a little Orwellian here. This is how you speak. I was going to pull some quotes out of it, but I don't want to stir the pot. But here's the article. American Medical Association goes woke, pushes CRT, communism, and language reform. And so I've got a copy. I forgot to bring it down today. You can read through this, and you can see that a lot of things we've been talking about over the past few weeks that might have been boring to you, they're concepts that are showing up all over the place, even in places that you might not think so. How's time here? Kendi proposes an amendment to the Constitution. He wants to fund a Department of Anti-Racism, trained experts who will monitor the policies and monitor public officials. If they say anything that could be deemed racist, right, they would be empowered with disciplinary tools to wield over and against policymakers. Is this a kind of amendment we would want to our Constitution to say to some people over here of an ideology we don't agree with, you can take my career away if I happen to be accused of saying something that could be remotely out of line with the anti-racist movement? All right, but let's face it, the biggest face of critical race theory in our midst over the last 2 years anyway, maybe 3 years, has been Black Lives Matter. All right. Now, I'm just going to say this right here. Look, this is sensitive stuff. Why is there a Black Lives Matter organization? I truly believe that many people who would support this organization just want to make the lives of some of our brothers and sisters of the African-American race have a better life. All right. So I don't doubt the good intentions there, but I want to talk about what the frame is of this group so that we're aware. First thing is the founders themselves had said, we are, don't say we're stupid people, we're just trying to make money. We have an ideological frame. We are Marxists. We know the ideologies that are out there in the world, and we're unabashedly saying, this is what we are. Okay, so I'm not accusing them of being a Marxist organization or neo-Marxist. They are saying that's what we are. They're on record with that. All right. How does this come up in our world? Well, it begins with Trayvon Martin. Well, these are the ladies that found it. Patrice Cullors, I believe, is retired from it. Alicia and Opal. Trayvon Martin is killed by George Zimmerman and is acquitted on the grounds of self-defense. That's how Black Lives Matter gets started in 2012. It was still kind of a fringe issue then. It becomes way more prominent right here in Ferguson in 2014 when Michael Brown kills Darren Wilson. Of course, he's, oh, sorry, yes, my bad. Trying to do math in public or read in public is not easy. Yeah, the other way around, right? So that's when it starts to, people are aware of it, but really, really, really explodes. And I'm talking explodes with Chauvin's killing of George Floyd in 2020. Okay, so this is when, before, if you were a social justice warrior, you might have gave money to Black Lives Matter. Now, pretty much everyone is doing it, okay, because of the grippiness of that moment right there. What is BLM's aim? Alter existing social conditions, and they're not ashamed to say by force if necessary, by dismantling traditional culture, disrupting the nuclear family, and socializing public education. All right, this is from their website. This language is now taken down. It's now taken down because it was hurting their donations. I'll just build this here. They're openly pro-violence. They're openly pro-transgender. They're especially against the Western prescribed nuclear family. That's probably one of their biggest things. Don't tell us a family should be a mom and a dad and kids go through life together. And finally, they're pro-LGBTQIA community. Now, if all we're talking about here is advancing the rights of people who identify that way or whatever it is, and not unduly oppressing them, then sure, we can get behind that. But that's not it. That's if you happen to say this worldview is not consistent with my Christianity, you will not be accepted by this movement. And then finally, since it's Life Sunday, I want to end with this. There's an epidemic being ignored by organizations like Black Lives Matter. Since 1973, 15.5 million Black lives have been aborted, right? Every year, well in excess of 250,000 Black lives are lost through abortion. It's the leading cause of death for Blacks over any other cause. Although Black women are only 13% of the population, they account for 35% of all abortions. Some say Planned Parenthood targets this minority community. I did a lot of reading on that, and I took that bullet out because I don't. There's a lot of data on both sides of that. Okay, you may have heard that 80% of Planned Parenthoods are in minority neighborhoods. They came out and tried to refute that, and I don't know enough to sort out the difference, and I didn't have time to. So I wouldn't just go around saying that unless you want to do the research yourself. But it is true that in New York, LA, and Philly, more Black babies are aborted than born. 31% of Blacks thought abortion was morally acceptable in 2007, and 2020, 46%. Now, I don't think this is any necessarily worse than whites or Hispanics or any other population, but what I'm saying is this is being ignored, and probably if a church that's pro-life wants to have an impact on the Black community, maybe it could be through helping in this capacity through Thrive and other organizations who try to partner with these unwed mothers or sometimes wed, and maybe possibly raise the ability of adoption or something like that to give these children a chance at life. And so it's tragic. It's not to pick on this segment of the population, but it is disproportionately affecting them in our midst. And yet, that is not considered a Black life that matters. I'm perfectly fine saying Black lives matter. They absolutely do, because they're creating the image of God just like any other life. But they also matter at this stage of things as well. So that's kind of how CRT is playing out in society. So you should probably be a little more well-versed in that by now. You probably didn't love sitting through today, but next week we're going to take a look at, okay, what can we embrace about this? And what do we have to push back against? Have a great day.